Hello, and welcome to Utopian and Dystopian Fictions, a podcast hosted by me, Matt Leggett, a senior lecturer at the University of Winchester, where I teach utopian and dystopian fiction.
And me, Liam Knight, an independent scholar who holds a PhD in English literature from the University of Birmingham.
In each episode, we interview a different scholar, thinker, or writer, asking them to help us myth bust commonly held assumptions about utopias and dystopias.
If you like what you hear, please let us know by following the podcast, rating it on Spotify, or dropping us a message on utopian and dystopian fictions at gmail.com. Right then, Matt, how about you tell our audience who we're talking to this time?
Right, well, we've got Heather Alberro, who is a lecturer in sustainability at the University of Manchester. And I'm just going to quote from her profile briefly, just to say a bit about what she does, because it's got a lot of stuff here. She's a transdisciplinary academic activist. Say that quickly is tricky, with areas of expertise and interest in the critical environmental, social sciences, and humanities, including radical and decolonial environmental politics, green utopianism, environmental movements, critical sustainabilities, and post-anthropocentric environmental ethics. She's really testing my podcasting skills or lack of them there, I think. Yeah, and this year she's already published two. I say already, I suppose it's right at the end of the year now, but she's published two books this year. Yeah, maybe there'll be a third one in the last month. I don't know. She's published a monograph titled Terrestrial Ecotopias, Multi-Species Flourishing in and Beyond the Capitalocene. Did I say that right? I don't know. I mean, Capitalocene? I've not heard that one before. It's a good one, though. And an edited collection, Utopian and Dystopian Explorations of Pandemics and Ecological Breakdown, Entangled Futurities, which she co-edited with Rhiannon Firth, Nora Castle, Emra Atasoy, and Comrade Scott. And it features a chapter by none other than myself. And also, claps. And also a chapter by Heather McKnight, who we spoke to in episode 4. And it's open access, so you can go away and read all that lovely research for free at your own leisure. Which is great. That's a genuinely, I think I know that Heather and everyone involved was really glad that the funding came through for that. So it's lovely to have stuff that's not behind a paywall when it's a book chapter. So yeah, so Liam, you were responsible for interviewing Heather this time out. So thanks for doing that. And yeah, I suppose that means I'm sort of on summing up duty. And yeah, one of the things that really struck me about your very interesting interview with Heather was her emphasis on utopianism and its sort of connection to animals, or its involvement with animals to some extent. And one of the things that I thought was quite nice, you dug out a little bit of information from her background, doing a bit of sleuthing about her work with turtles.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I just found it really insightful, this idea that, what we need isn't just a world with better relationships for humans, but also with better relations for all. And that all meaning, encompassing, the animal world in particular. And I thought this was quite a nice way to connect two fields, which I guess, when you stop and think about them, they're obviously not that separate, but I think we can often sort of compartmentalize these things, can't we? The sort of work of wildlife and nature conservation as being kind of separate from the work that we want to do towards sort of building a kinder society. So, I think the vast majority of people out there do think that species collapse is a bad thing, as much as all the kind of Attenborough documentaries and things, it does sort of get people going, but they might not connect those issues necessarily with sort of other prevailing political attitudes. So I think if we go back a little bit to our discussion that we had with Heather McKnight in episode 4, we again encountering that sort of sentiment that, yeah, it's bad, but what can we as humans do about it kind of attitude that you might encounter. But I think what Heather's doing, or Heather Alberro that is she's working in this really interesting interdisciplinary space, which enables her to make connections between culture and politics, And so, for example, in the interview, she was talking about her literary background, her interest in H.G. Wells, for instance. But at the same time, she's also working on a handbook for like net zero. So,
Mm.
um, really interesting kind of, I suppose, intersections there. And then, yeah, just one of the other things that I really enjoyed about the interview was the really like positive atmosphere, like the real positivity that it's really difficult, isn't it, to be positive in today's climate, I think,
Yeah.
particularly when you talk about these issues. And so for her to be advocating for these positive solutions rather than just like offering up critique.
Yeah.
Heather made the point herself that there's much more out there written on eco dystopias than there is on eco utopias, but that there are things that engaged people are doing to help the environment and to develop like the kind of frameworks, if you like, for a kind of planet for all humans, flora and fauna alike, really.
Yeah, amazing, Matt. Thank you for summarizing that for the listeners and giving a sort of sneak peek at what's to come. Hopefully, it really comes across, yeah, in the interview that I had a great time chatting with Heather and sort of reconnecting. And I think, yeah, you really hit the nail on the head on some of the real highlights for me from the episode. Whether that is once again making utopia or utopianism something that feels possible or real or just active rather than being this sort of purely theoretical consideration. I think for me, the sort of discussion of humans and non-humans and can we make a utopia for everyone and all rather than just for people and humanity, I think was quite eye-opening for me and was again maybe an angle that I don't typically consider in my day-to-day or in my work traditionally. Matt, I don't know if Heather's sort of discussion, the things she was offering to us, has it sort of brought any other texts to mind for you or any sort of ideas to mind for you?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about as much as I've just sort of said about how there's too much stuff on eco dystopias rather than eco utopias. I'm now going to reach for my bag of dystopias, but yeah, I think Agostina Bazterrica's "Tender as the Flesh" sort of particularly popped into my brain. It's a novel that I've been teaching recently. I don't, are you familiar with it?
Yeah, it's something I read during my PhD. Didn't include in the thesis in the end, but a text that is like deeply unsettling, but also incredibly beautiful, and is one that I do recommend to a lot of people, only to then get weird looks on their faces once they do a quick Google on the summary of it.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a beautiful text.
I think I traumatize my students with it a little bit. But actually, I'm surprised every time because it gets a really like good reception. I think students
Mm.
really quite like it, and it's got one. I mean, I won't spoil the ending, but it's got an absolutely horrific ending.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, really brutal. But I mean, yeah, one of the things in particular about that. So, I mean, the brief premise of the text is that all animals are infected with a virus, and so they have to be killed. And yeah, this ends up meaning that because people are so desperate for meat, they start becoming cannibals, and there's an industrialized process of kind of cannibalization or whatever that gets put in place instead of the meat industry. So I mean, it sounds preposterous in a lot of ways, and you can't take it seriously. You can't actually think, well, would we all become cannibals if we had to become? It's either cannibalism or vegetarianism, and we go for cannibalism, right? It sounds a bit silly, but the industrial process idea is quite interesting. The fact that when your industry collapses, that industry is so powerful, it has a certain lobbying power that it sort of transforms this into this new industry. You might sort of think about that in relation to the move away from sort of petrol
yeah, yeah,
and these things, and the fact that all the adverts on TV now are kind of advertising the switch to renewables and how they kind of get involved in this other industry. um, but yeah, but the other thing is, of course, the knock-on effect is that there are no animals in the text, and there are some really poignant and quite horrifying, I think, moments that just make you think, well, what would happen if animals disappeared? And there was one in particular that struck me, and I've made a note of this quote because I think it's a really good quote from the novel. Bazterrica writes, there are people around, but it seems deserted, describing the streets. And it's not just because the population has been reduced. Ever since animals were eliminated, there's been a silence that nobody hears, and yet it's there always, resounding throughout the city. It's a shrill silence that can be seen on people's faces, in their gestures, in the way they look at one another. It's as if everyone's lives rather have been detained, as if they were waiting for the nightmare to end. I thought that was it's a really kind of profound idea that actually the silence is a kind of deafening silence
Mm,
in this instance, and it's that that you don't realize the profundity of animal sort of life until it's gone,
mm,
and in its absence, that's when we kind of realize that. So yeah, I was thinking about that. I mean, animals disappearing from texts, I think, is also just like a bit of a
yeah.
dystopian theme. I was also just thinking about Yoko Ogawa's The Memory Police, which I know we've
Yeah,
mentioned a
yeah.
bit before, and very early on in the text, birds disappear, don't
Birds.
they?
Yeah.
And there's something very symbolic about that. So yeah, how we treat animals tells us a lot about how we treat each other in a lot of these texts. And so when you have, oh yeah, I'm thinking about J.G. Ballard's High Rise, and the fact that
Mm,
opens with the protagonist eating a dog on the spit. I mean, again, it's a really horrible image. Yeah, so there is there is actually quite a lot of sort of dystopian texts that do um, uh, you know particularly address this kind of issue of how we treat each other through how people treat animals.
I think you've reminded me as well, whilst we've been chatting, of two texts that are somewhere in the utopian dystopian space. And at this point in time, I can't really decide on which side of the spectrum they fall, or if actually their ambivalence is part of the point and part of the genre, really. Both to do with bees, because my mum loves bees, and
Mm.
so I always look out for books about bees. So one is The Bees by Laline Paul, and the other is called The History of Bees, I think, by Maya Lund, I want to say.
Yeah,
I'm just going to
yeah,
quickly, yeah, it's correct, yeah. And I think, the texts you've just discussed are ones where we see either the absolute loss of animals, or we see maybe how in these sort of circumstances that are incredibly dystopian for humanity, there's also these ramifications for the non-human too. So you've just talked about High Rise, where the character's eating the dog at the opening, and I guess the harsh circumstances for humans has also led to harsh circumstances for animals too.
mm,
And I think The Bees by Laline Paul does something slightly differently in that it's a utopia or dystopia about the beehive and about sort of that functioning. And although maybe it's probably quite clearly like an allegory for human society and hierarchies and systems and whatnot, I think it still is very, I don't know, like special, or it stands out to me at the very least in that it is very animal centric, or very insect centric, and that's really putting the non-human to the forefront of this sort of genre. And then likewise with The History of Bees by Maya Lund, it's been a while since I read it, but I seem to remember it being like a story told across three different times in history, right? So we've got, and there's like a more contemporary period, there's a far future period, and then there's one set. I don't know, is it like
it's in the late 1800s from
yeah,
memory, I think. Yeah.
and we see sort of, again, that maybe that's more human centric, but I think we see there like the real importance of humans' relationships with animals or the non-human, um, both in like the positive, but also maybe sometimes in the negative. How maybe sort of we don't interact so well. But I remember, and maybe this is a spoiler, so spoiler alert um, for Lund's text, but I seem to remember the novel's about the disappearance of bees, or at least like the future segment of it is. And I think I remember, Matt, like by the end, that is there some sort of glimmer of hope that they've returned, or I just remember that
Yeah,
there's
yeah, there
yeah.
is. Yeah, absolutely. So the I actually teach the history of bees
Oh, amazing.
on my globalization module, as well as Tender as the Flesh. This is a bit of a review for me. I haven't read the bees. I have to
Oh, it's
admit,
brilliant.
but I have to look out for that. But yeah, the history of bees. So at the end of the text, so well, at the beginning of the text, one of the main characters. There's three timelines, and this timeline's the future China timeline,
Mm.
sort of at the end of the sort of 21st century China. I think it's 20. I want to say it's 2098 or something like that. And yeah, basically they're having to hand pollinate
Yeah.
the kind of, the trees and these kinds of things, because without bees, it's not just the bees that disappear, it's the, the plants and the fruit and the trees and these kinds of things. And actually hand pollination, has already gone on at certain
Mm.
points, particularly in China. I think in the 1980s that they had a bee shortage and there was hand pollination going on, so that's, I think, where she drew that idea from. um, and yeah, one of her child, the I think she's called Tao, the character, and her child disappears. Um, and basically, we discover later that the child has been stung by a bee, and so the kind of loss of the child, as a child has an allergic reaction to it, the loss of the child is actually also the kind of hope for the future, because it's evidence that bees are actually returning. But
Mm.
yeah, it's a striking text, really interesting. And again, I think that the main thing, and the reason I kind of teach on globalization, is because of that kind of sense of interdependence,
Yeah.
or that we have, and we tend to think about interdependence in relation to globalization on other people, other states, non-state actors, and these kinds of things. But actually, this kind of throws up this sort of other sort of other parts of that, which is our interdependence on the environment
Yeah. Yeah.
and our increasingly tense, in relationship with that, our kind of the fact we're in tension with it all the time. So yes, an interesting text. I hadn't thought about that one, even though
No,
again, it
no.
was a few weeks ago I was teaching it. But yeah, you're right. So there are a lot of texts out there, aren't there, that yeah, that focus that dystopia on the absence of wildlife, etc.
Yeah, and I almost feel like it's a shame that you know all these examples are now coming to our mind because it's kind of maybe reinforcing what Heather was saying, that there's so much around eco dystopias out there, or sort of negative projections of climate change gone horrifically wrong. I'm even thinking about Parable of the Sower as well at the moment, with
Yeah,
sort of the sort of visions of uh, forests and whatnot on fire. Um, but I almost wish I could bring to mind some examples of eco-utopian texts, and ones that I'm really familiar with, and ones also that I'm not familiar with because Heather's only mentioned to me the other day in the interview. But I know she lists a good number of them, and hopefully that's something that I don't want to give that away almost. I want Heather's sort of expertise there to really speak through on those texts.
yeah. Do you want to play the interview then?
Yeah, I guess I should then. Let's roll the jingle. Heather, I know you come at utopianism and utopia from quite a few different angles, but I was wondering, maybe to kick things off, what does utopia mean to you? What sort of angle or approach do you come at it with?
Yeah, I mean, so it's sort of a journey over the years that your understanding and approach to this concept evolves. But it's for me, it's an intersectional undertaking that has a lot of different components, and it's something that's also, I think, fundamentally always processual. So there is no end state. So kind of going back to maybe some of the layman's or like kind of other typical understandings of utopia as like a perfect endpoint that you arrive at, and we've kind of resolved all of the social conflicts that could arise. Whereas I don't see it the way I see it as a perpetual striving for the better being something that is collectively decided and is historically sort of contingent, and depending on the context you're in, this will take on different forms. And it's something that it's a kind of social undertaking, kind of going back to Sargent's, I think, original sort of multi-faceted definition of it. And it's like the lifeblood of social change, and what makes really life worth living, in the sense of striving for the better. So yeah.
Yeah, it sounds amazing. I like the idea that utopia is never a fixed thing. It's not an end point. It's a process, right? It's that continual building towards, striving towards something. I know in particular as I said, you're a lecturer in sustainability. I know that green utopianism is something that's really core to sort of your work and sort of your stance on utopianism. I was wondering, I come from utopia and dystopia from primarily a literary angle. So I was wondering, could you educate me and maybe our listeners, what is green utopianism? How does that differ from maybe like more literary understandings of utopianism?
Yeah, green utopianism or ecotopianism, different ways to refer to it. Basically, yeah, it's the more specific subgenre. So it's radical critiques of industrial capitalist society, etc. And they're particularly these oppressive systems, social and ecological impacts. And then in the visionary aspects of the second component of the utopian for the spectrum, it would involve visions for sustainable futures, typically, although, and this is what I'm interested in kind of exploring in my work, is to what extent there's variation in that visioning side. So it'll often involve imagining a sustainable future where humans have figured out how to live in ways, within planetary boundaries, using fewer resources, living in kind of harmonious interaction with nature, quote unquote. But then within that, there are different visions. There's the more technocratic side, kind of where technology is sort of plays a central role. In sort of facilitating abundance. And then you have the more post-centric examples of green utopianism. And this is what I touch on a little bit in my book on terrestrial ecotopias, where you get there's more of a foregrounding of better worlds, not just for humans, but crucially for other species, and how can we interact with other species in these green utopias in ways that are less exploitative. And that's the kind of side that I'm very interested in. And I examine that in multiple different kind of forms, whether it's literary works or social movements. And I'm also, my original background is, I have a little bit of kind of grounding in English literature and in the humanities, but I'm also maybe predominantly a critical social scientist by background. So when I approach like literary texts, which is interesting that you bring that up, I don't come at it as a literary scholar. I apply like kind of critical, social, ethical, philosophical lenses to my analysis of these works. So that's another kind of maybe interesting distinction there in my approach.
Yeah, I think again, having sort of seen you talk at conferences and having sort of looked at some of your work, I think you do come at this from a really interesting and really like unique angle that for me again maybe sort of really firmly in literary studies. It's really fascinating. So thank you for your contributions to the sort of to the field, Heather. And actually, that brings me to like sort of another question or a sort of follow-on question. Because I was wondering before we were chatting if you see green utopianism as being like something that's literary or something that's like more, I guess, like real world and sort of rooted in activism. So are you sort of saying actually it's a bit of both? Like we see green utopianism or eco-utopianism both in literary works, but also in real world acts of resistance and change?
Oh yeah, most definitely. So it's a spectrum, kind of like the utopian imaginary in the sort of more general stuff, as well as dystopias as well. So you see ecotopias alive in, for example, classic literary works like Colin Bach's Ecotopia. You see it in one of my favorite ecotopian novels, Starhawk's The Fifth Sacred Thing, and also more indigenous-inspired approaches. There's the anthology that also I'm very fond of, Joshua Whitehead's Love After the End. It's an anthology of indigiqueer sci-fi and speculative fiction, but also there are a few chapters in there that have like ecotopian themes. So you have the literary manifestations of these, but you also have social movements. I mean, to varying degrees, you could frame, well, some XR to a degree. You could also like the various climate movements, which are iterations, instantiations, bursting forth of green utopian visions and critiques. As well as some of the more radical environmental activist groups like Earth First and the Galenda. So I think, and this is what always fascinates me, is that it is a vast spectrum. And this isn't even touching on like intentional communities. My colleague Rhiannon Firth is more of an expert in that area. I've always wanted to research that, but I haven't had the time or the funding yet. But it's a spectrum of so many different examples, and film as well, of course. Loads of different, examples.
Yeah, wow, it's great to hear. Yeah, this is something that has got both like the literary, the filmic, as you're saying, and then like the sociological, the activism. Again, I'm sure Just Stop Oil. I'm sure is exactly is seen as a movement here too. And yes, that's fantastic. I think it's really helpful for like myself and Matt and listeners of the podcast. We're trying to bring lots of different approaches. So we've got lots of literary, but we had another Heather McKnight was telling us about sort of utopianism. Yeah, we got claps from you as well, Heather. Yeah. Yeah, we had Heather McKnight come and talk to us about sort of utopianism and activism a few episodes ago. So yeah, it's nice to have this sort of undercurrent as well, I think, to make utopias not just literary, to make utopias, active again, or to make utopias real again, or to keep that sort of philosophy alive. Heather, you were sort of saying your grounding is in the literary, it's in the sociological, it's in the social critical, and so on. And hopefully already our listeners can see, or rather hear, that your passion and love and interest for this research topic is unquestionable. What my question is, not to put you on the spot, but my question is, how did you first get into this area? So what first interested you in utopianism, green eco-utopias, and so on?
Oh my, well, I've always had a lifelong passion for the environment and particularly other animals since I was really, really kind of young, as far as my earliest memories, 4 or 5 years old. But then I kind of stumbled into in Miami in my undergrad studies. I came across the group, the Venus Project, just kind of had sort of more the techno eco-utopian side in terms of the visions. It's kind of very cybernetic vision of the future, where there's kind of sustainable societies that are like it was led by an industrial engineer, Jean Fresco, who he would design ecologically sustainable infrastructure that had very minimal impacts, and he was all about utilizing technology, AI, but the reduction of inequalities. And so it was very kind of a technocratic vision, but it was what first introduced me to quite radical visions of other worlds, alternatives. And then I also was a huge fan of H.G. Wells's work, which he also is a good example of a vast spectrum. I mean, he's traditionally sci-fi, but he has he's written dystopian and utopian works. And then, I kind of followed these studies, and but I never, in terms of utopian studies as a field or a discipline that you could go into and study at postgrad level, I didn't really come across until I was a second year PhD student. And when and then also when I went to my first utopian studies conference in Prato in 2019, I think it was. And that's when I the whole framing of utopian studies and how interdisciplinary it is, how it's so many angles, it's sociological, it's historical discussions, it's literary. And when I came across that framework, it kind of changed pretty much everything, the way I viewed everything. I mean, those elements were already there, and that kind of radical hope, but that really changed. That was a game changer. And since then, that's been the framework I use to not just in professionally and research, but in a very personal sense. But born and bred utopian.
Yeah. It's almost like you had this utopian impulse almost yourself inherently, but then I guess it was almost subconscious almost, right? And then you're saying that you kind of not stumbled into it, but you said you went to the conference in 2019 and it was quite eye-opening for you and sort of really changed your view on things. But going back to sort of some of your beginnings with this, I'm right in thinking, Heather, I was again, I was saying to you earlier over email, I was looking at your research profile and sort of LinkedIn and stuff. I'm right in thinking, is this when you were doing your undergraduate back in the States? You did a conservation project to do with, was it turtles? Was it turtles that I saw or something like that? Sorry, I thought it was a nice, cool little tidbit to sort of mention.
Oh yes, no. So when I was over the span of maybe around 2 years, around early undergrad. At the moment, the exact time escaped me, but I was doing volunteer work with an organization called Sea Turtle Oversight Protection, and they did various kinds of work on citizen science and kind of educating the public about sea turtles and the threats that they face and how to conserve them. But we would also, a lot of the work we would do is go and sit on basically guard their nests along the beach at night, because that was kind of the hatchlings tend to come out at night. It's better cover, there's fewer predators, and then they can race to the water. But because of development along particularly South Florida coast, all the hotels and the houses, the lights, they sort of have been, like this inner drive to follow the moonlight to the beach. But now they get distracted because of all of the lighting on the beach. So they've been going the opposite way and going into the streets or getting into all kinds of havoc. So we would sit there and watch them when they would come out, direct them to the beach, and also as a deterrent. against poaching. I mean, that was actually quite dangerous. Looking back, I'm like, oh, could have gotten quite dicey. But that was just one of the most amazing kind of work that I did. And another kind of similar job I did, also kind of second and third year undergrad, is when I did volunteering work for R.J. Dunlop Marine Conservation Program, which is like a research center based out of my old uni at the University of Miami. Okay. And that one, we would go out like an entire day, sometimes 2 days, on research trips off of the South Florida coast, Biscayne Bay, to catch and satellite tag sharks of various species. Incredible work. I mean, the most physically demanding stuff I've ever done. I've gotten all kinds of scars, bruises, beat up to hell, but it was incredible. So yeah, that was quite formative in terms of really further cementing my biophilia, really.
Yeah. No, I think, really that's sort of inspirational to hear. You're not just sort of absolutely phenomenal scholar, but also you're a professional turtle protector and clearly a shark wrangler as well. It's amazing to hear. Really, quite. There's me thinking I just read books and write about them, and I just sit in a room or an office, and there's you doing stuff in the world. It's really impressive. And actually, Heather, I'm going to embarrass you a little bit, maybe here. I hope you don't mind, but I think when I first met you in 21 Brighton, I think 2021. And I just remember being just sort of, I think, a bit in awe of what you were doing. Basically, I just saw you as being like this. I'm genuinely not just saying this, as being like a total role model for just like someone who, an early career researcher who's doing so many phenomenal things. I mean, I was just digging up sort of your publication sort of history earlier, and in 2020, so this year, you've had 2 publications come out, right? You had Terrestrial Ecotopias, that was through the Ralleheim Press, wasn't it? And then you co-edited a book with Palgrave, the Utopian Dystopian Explorations of Pandemics and Ecological Breakdown, which Matt has a chapter in, so there's like a little tie-in to the podcast. But then you've published a couple of times on environmental resistance. You had a book in 23, so you've had 2 monographs come out in the last 2 years, as well as a co-edited collection this year. And then moreover, you published on Wells, who you spoke about earlier. You talk about eco-apocalypse versus ecotopianism. And then, just sort of generally, I've just put it in my notes, just top-notch research outputs generally. I didn't know, Heather, if you wanted to tell us, maybe briefly, a little bit about maybe, how you have amassed such an impressive publication track record as again, like someone who's still I hope you don't want to say like an early career researcher. You're sort of it's not like you've been doing this for 20, 30 years. You're someone who's still really sort of fresh and exciting. Or if you want to tell us anything about any of the publications in particular, either any of the recent ones or older ones or whatever, really, just the space is yours.
Oh no, you're too kind, Liam. I mean, I was like a burst of activity, like kind of closer to the latter parts of the PhD and right after that. I think I am still technically early career. I'm 5 years since. It depends on how it doesn't matter. But yeah, it's I did at some point though start to kind of burn out a little bit when I was taking on all that, as well as my roles with the Political Studies Association, the admin stuff, and then the job market when I was still work. But it's been quite a ride. One of my favorite works other than maybe my latest, the monograph, Terrestrial Ecotopias, which was essentially my PhD plus, like revamped plus a few new chapters. But the Wells article, I had an absolute blast because I was unearthing, I was trying to chart like the spectrum of his writing and some of the changes in his approach to the human nature relationship and technology in his ecotopian works, and across the spectrum of his writing. And then I got a hold of the last piece of work he wrote before he died, like I think a year before he passed away, just after the Second World War, called Mind at the End of Its Tether. And I remember just reading it in a pub and I was just like crying because you can see and I talk about this in the kind of intro to my book, Terrestrial Ecotopias, you could see his optimism, his utopian spirit kind of fading at the end of his life. I mean, not just because he lived through 2 world wars, but he was also quite ill at the time. That's partly why he passed away. But it was really heartbreaking to kind of see this, and it was such a powerful experience to just work on this article. And I was like, actually, I got to write about on one of my favorite authors, so that was really, really fun. And that got me through, a lot of some of the challenging times when I was trying to find work after the PhD. And Yeah, at the moment, I've signed a new contract for a new edited collection, and I told myself I'd take a damn break because, like I said, I was sort of getting burnt out. But here we go. You know, you kind of love this stuff, and you get sucked into new opportunities, and it's hard to turn them down. Although it's a difficult line to tread because you want to preserve your sanity and make sure you don't take on too much. But then you also there's the pressure of being an early career scholar and feeling like if you don't take these things on and build up your CV, you know, what happens in terms of your job prospects. There's a lot to consider here, but it's also quite fun because I just love writing. So
Natural born scholar, Heather. No, I mean, I was looking at the utopian dystopian reflections of pandemics and ecological breakdowns earlier today because I said Matt's in it. I know a couple of people from like my university here in it, and even sort of looking at your co-editors there. We've got a who's who basically of the rising generation, the next generation of sort of utopian dystopian scholars. Right, we've got Emra Atasoy in there. I know Rhiannon Fairfield you mentioned. Nora Castle's in that. There's another co-editor whose name I can't remember right now. Do you want to just jump in and let me know who that was?
yeah, Conrad Scott.
That's it, Conrad. Yeah. So again, there's just loads of really excellent people in there, and I think the question for you, I guess, is what's it like to be? Maybe I'm sort of bigging you up and sort of when you're not realizing how impressive this stuff is, but how does it feel, I guess, to be working in such a lively and exciting. I mean, like the people we've just mentioned, like everyone's doing really amazing, cool stuff in the space. How does it feel to be like right on the front lines, part of that, doing some really impressive sort of work in the area?
It's really exciting. I'm just like, I mean, every time a new article or piece of writing or piece of work comes out in this area, I'm always kind of scouting, seeing anything that's come out that's vaguely relevant to ecotopias or green utopianism. And it's just so exciting, and the amount of incredible work, and all of this stuff is always a collective endeavor. There's no such thing as an individual or self-made person or anything like that. No islands here, but it's that's. I mean, I find it really exciting, and then I just go down these crazy rabbit holes. Like I'll read something, and you go down the reference list, and you go to the next thing, and then before you know it, I'm like, what's going on? Yeah, it's exciting, daunting, and yeah, I mean, especially with Green Utopias, because it's, I mean, at least so far, maybe, I don't know to what extent it's my perception, but there seems to be a lot of work in terms of publications, but also film content on dystopias, eco-dystopias in particular, which makes sense, with the triple planetary crisis of pollution, climate breakdown, and biodiversity loss. But there's relatively little in terms of positive ecological vision. So it's also kind of an area where we need more people, as many people as possible. I would say working on this, but then I'm quite biased.
No, I guess in the last episode with Sebastian Mitchell, we were talking about how it's easier at the moment, given sort of current circumstances and context, to imagine a negative future than it is to imagine a more positive one. But you're right, Heather. Yeah, the more people we have working in sort of in the more utopian angle of here we talk about sort of eco utopias and green utopias and so on. I suppose firstly the closer we'll edge towards that, but then the more this will appear on people's radars. Hopefully I think it's very easy to get quite depressed and quite doom scrolly looking in the news and sort of looking at the climate crisis and all the various implications there, and it's easy, I think, to get bogged down and defeated by that. So hopefully the more people we have looking at it from maybe a different angle and the more people we have who are refusing to get defeated by that sort of sentiment and trying to really battle against it, hopefully we'll be able to turn the tides, to use maybe a slightly unfortunate ecological metaphor. Heather, obviously we talked about a lot of the work that you've done recently and sort of all the really exciting things you've been up to even this year alone, but moving on, I guess the question would be, what's next? I know you said you don't want to do too much, you need to take a break, look after yourself and so on, but is there anything, any articles, chapters you've got working on the moment, or sort of a research project you've got in mind? What would you like to be doing next?
Yeah, I've got, I guess this is maybe one of the aspects of being a transdisciplinary researchers that you've always got like multiple potential lines of investigation on the horizon at once, and it's so difficult to actually pick a path and stick to it. But In terms of concrete things at the moment, like I mentioned, I just signed the contract to co-edit a handbook, Elgar handbook on the politics of net zero with my amazing colleagues. So that is going to be the bigger project over the next few years. I'm also finishing, I've finished the edits for an article that's currently under review for the journal Environmental Philosophy. I'm basically exploring some barriers that I would kind of point out within certain discourses of veganism, especially the emphasis on zoocentrism rather than a more inclusive ecocentric approach to like multi-species, like basically well-being and challenging human attitudes that are exploited and problematic. So that it's like a philosophical, environmental, ethical piece that should be at some point finalized. It's been quite a while because it's quite a difficult piece of work. So those two, and then I would love to. I'm still wanting to explore and find new examples of eco-utopianism to write about, to explore. I'm also working at the moment, since my new role is teaching and scholarship. So I am mostly like most of my job is about curriculum design and pedagogies. I'm trying to work with a colleague on eco-utopian pedagogies and how to embed that in curriculum and assessment design and content and things like that. So those are the main things I'm going to try to stick to for now. Because like, again, that tendency to take on everything at once, and then you're just like,
But that's also like, again, you've got sort of your different strands there, right? You've got this edited sort of collection, you've got this article, and then again, like my background is in teaching. Right? I used to be a school teacher, and so hearing, whenever someone says curriculum design, my ears prick up, and I'm very excited, and sort of hearing, that you're I guess to make utopianism, and green utopianism, eco-utopianism, to make that something that is practical and is, almost something that students are seeing as a practical sort of phenomena rather than just something purely theoretical, I think is really powerful. So fingers crossed, Heather. Again, you'll change I don't know, students thinking one university at a time. So in Manchester, we're very lucky to have you. I am mindful of time, Heather, and thank you so much for meeting with us today, or just me at the moment. But myself and Matt are sort of treating this podcast as a way to do many different things, and one of those things, in a slightly vain fashion, is just to add more things to our reading lists. So as a sign-off question, Heather, I was wondering, with utopianism and maybe like green utopianism and eco-utopianism in mind, if you were to say to someone, right, you should read or watch or interact or do maybe even this one thing to really get to grips with that area, notwithstanding your publications, of course, what would you recommend to somebody and why? You're allowed maybe two things if one's too tricky, but what would you choose and why?
Okay, I'm gonna have to say Starhawk's The Fifth Sacred Thing that I mentioned earlier, and Ursula Le Guin's Always Coming Home, her eco-utopian novel. Those are both eco-utopian literary works. They're my favorite examples of ecotopias, in the sense of that kind of radical critique, and then that vision of an ecological society, because they are wonderfully intersectional. So they feature like sort of social justice elements, critiques of the present in the sense of like the linking between environmental breakdown and destruction, and also various kinds of systemic injustices around gender, around racism. And they're also to varying degrees indigenous inspired. So the worlds that they sort of depict and imagine are, very, in terms of also the centering and the foregrounding of other species, like in Starhawk's Fifth Sacred Thing, their kind of mode of political organization is they have like representatives that try to empathize with and speak on behalf of species and ecosystems that are under sort of like acknowledged. So the foregrounding of the other than human, and the message that like it's a kind of a wider web of relations and better future should be for all, not just for humans, is these are strong themes and elements in these two works. So if anybody is interested in ecotopias, I would highly recommend these two. There's such a huge list, but I would say those to start with.
Amazing, thanks, Heather. Yeah, sorry to make you have to whittle this huge list down, or this huge bibliography down to just the two, but I think those sound like really compelling starting points for our listeners, readers, whatever you want to call them, to get stuck in. Heather, I appreciate you're really tight for time today, so thank you so much for meeting with me. It's been lovely to catch up, and just to fanboy a little bit over all the amazing stuff you're doing. It's just like really, I think, empowering to see, someone who like a really good person go and achieve really cool things. Only ever so slightly jealous of the things that you're doing. Don't worry. But no, I will say a big thank you on behalf of myself and Matt and our listeners for your time today. I hope you've got a lovely weekend ahead of you, and it's almost Christmas, so I hope you have a lovely holiday period as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Liam, for having me. And this has been wonderful. And also thanks to you and Matt for having this podcast. This is fantastic. Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Once more, I'd like to thank Heather for her time. Hearing her thoughts about Green Utopianism and how creating a positive future ought to be inclusive of all species, not just humanity, was really insightful, as was her belief that this should not just be a literary endeavour, but a practical mission. You can find out more about Heather's work in this episode description, where I will link out to some of her publications. This was the final interview of season 1 of the podcast, but do keep a lookout for a very special festive episode coming soon. As per usual, if you have enjoyed this episode, please let us know by rating and following the podcast, writing a comment, or dropping us an email on utopian and dystopianfictions@gmail.com. We hope you'll join us again soon, where we will delve into some more utopian and dystopian fictions.